Fuel management is more than just making sure you have enough fuel to reach your destination. It's about optimizing every drop from takeoff to landing to ensure safety and efficiency and cost effectiveness. Whether you're cruising at 7,000 feet or managing a cross-country flight, understanding how to monitor and adjust your fuel consumption is a skill every pilot should master. In this episode, we're going to explore the latest fuel terminology, best practices for maintaining a fuel log, monitoring in flight, cleaning mixtures, and the key moments in flight where fuel management plays a crucial role. I'm going to discuss all this and more coming right up. So strap in and let's get into it.
Standby star 9000, 1013, Kilo 25. Coordinating aileron and rudder, bank, balance, bank pressure, rolling to 30 degrees. That's 30 degrees there. 3 left, runway 29, 1631.
G'day everyone and welcome to episode 139 of the Flight Training Australia podcast. From Birdsville to Exmouth, Truscott to Launceston and everywhere in between. This is the podcast all about flight training and flying in Australia and beyond. I'm your host Trent Robinson, g'day, and welcome to another episode. So Pacific Air Show has wrapped up again for year 2. Unfortunately, I didn't make it, but I know a lot of you did, and the pictures and things that I've seen online have been looking absolutely fantastic, and I think it's just one of those events that can only get bigger and better every year. If you haven't seen some of the photos coming from online there with the moon in the background and the aircraft just framed to perfection, it's just awesome stuff. So yeah, definitely have a look around. You'll see those popping up on the various Facebook groups, and yeah, just some awesome images there. Well done to all the performers, all the international special guests, but of course our very own Freedom Formation team, Matt Hall, Emma McDonald, and all the other display pilots that were there. Well done, guys. Did us all proud, and just some awesome flying displays, awesome crowds. Looks like the weather just turned it on and it was raining, and then it just came good. So well done to the weather gods there as well. Closer to home back here in Darwin, we had the first 452 Squadron Tower Party in about 3-4 years now. Just with COVID and staff shortages and everything else, it takes a bit to put these things on. But it happened very quickly, so well done to everyone. Again, I don't want to mention names to single anyone out, but fantastic night. We had nearly 270 people there. The team were doing tower tours through approach in the tower all night, and just great food, great drinks, great conversation, and a great night had by everyone. So thanks for holding that function, and it was really great to catch up with so many of you. A lot I know, a lot I don't know, and yeah, we just couldn't stop talking all night. It was awesome. So great to do that sort of thing. I think bringing the whole industry together, air traffic controllers and the pilots and everything else, and chance to ask questions and see behind the microphone and what goes on in the tower and the approach control center is really, really important. What else is happening? AFAP, a few of you have messaged me and just let me know that AFAP are coming around to Darwin, Kununurra and Broome. 27th of August here in Broome at the Trailer Boat Club, and then the next day, 28th in Kununurra at the Kimberley Grand Resort, and then the 29th in Broome at the Mangrove. And they're going to be talking about the latest pilot award and everything that AFAP do. So definitely worthwhile checking out. I've done an episode a while ago explaining the pilot award and how that works, and I think it's really, really important to be armed with that information for every pilot so they understand their rights and what's going on with the pilot award, how it works, and whether you're being paid correctly or not. So as I always say, knowledge is power, and I think that's a good thing to do. AFAP did great work representing pilots as well when they get themselves in a bit of trouble or in awkward situations. So definitely worthwhile having a look and go and have a brew, and again, great networking opportunity as well. Speaking of networking opportunities, CASA were up here in Darwin the other day for another nav safety seminar, and funnily enough, the topic was fuel in the tanks, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. I've been planning this episode for a little while, and then doing that seminar kind of triggered me into finishing it and getting it out there. So that's what we're going to get into. And at the seminar, they talked about a few accidents, talking about fuel starvation versus exhaustion, and running through the some incidents that had happened and why. But where I felt it was a little bit short was just really explaining the latest fuel terminology and what you actually need to be considering in full with your fuel planning and terminology, and especially what the advisory circular goes into detail with. So that's what I'm going to do in this episode. This is applicable to everyone, whether you're flying privately or commercially. I'm not going to go into airline 121 stuff. There are differences there, and I just don't have enough time for all of that. It's going to get too confusing, but I'm hoping by the time you get to that point, you know what you're doing as well. So if you haven't looked at it before, you need to download a copy of the advisory circular. Now, remember, advisory circulars are the new CAP. They're the Civil Aviation Advisory publication. The new format is the AC, and they're gradually being replaced by ACs. And the one you want to look up is 91-15. And at the time of recording this podcast, the latest version is version 1.1. And there are some differences. There are some similarities. There are some same things that we always used to do. But this is the latest guide that you want to consult. So rather than just sort of relying on what instructors tell you or what you think you need to do or what you always used to do, this is the document you want to have a bit of a read of, and this will give you an idea of where you are doing it right and maybe where you need to just review things in conjunction with what I'm going to talk about now. So the first part we want to probably just discuss is some of the differences in terminology between CAR 1988 and CAR 91 of the CASRs. Basically trying again, as we've done with so many other facets of aviation and regulations, to bring it into line with international standards. So fuel management side of things like that, there's a few terminology changes. Now, we generally generalize a lot of these terms. We know what we're talking about at the end of the day, but you will see these terms come up in various CASA documents, for example, and that's where a bit of confusion can come from if we don't sort of move on to the new terms. So let's have a look at a few of those. So the first one is alternate fuel. It's now destination alternate fuel. Decision point is point of in-flight replanning. Kind of makes sense, really, if you think about it. Destination aerodrome is the planned destination aerodrome. Destination alternate is the destination alternate aerodrome. En route alternate is the en route alternate aerodrome. And probably the most commonly known, hopefully, now is fixed reserve or fixed fuel reserve is now final reserve fuel. And variable reserve is now contingency fuel. So fixed is now final, variable is now contingency. So you will see those terms banded around a little bit. All right. So as far as the pre-flight planning process goes, it obviously it includes a calculation of the amount of fuel that's usable that we need to have on board. And this is leading towards our total fuel amount that we need to plan. So when we're doing our fuel planning, these are all the things that we need to consider. So the amount of usable fuel required on board at the commencement of a flight needs to include the following: your taxi fuel, your trip fuel, your destination alternate fuel, your holding fuel, your contingency fuel, your final reserve fuel, and additional fuel. Now, let's work out what all this means. So first of all, our taxi fuel. And this might seem obvious for some of these, but you'd be surprised the answers I get sometimes, and there is a little bit of confusion among people. So taxi fuel is the amount of fuel expected to be used by an aircraft before takeoff, taking into account the local conditions at the departure aerodrome, including, obviously, taxi time and traffic congestion. And boy, oh boy, have we been putting that to the test with pitch black up here lately. I joked at to the refuelers the other day that they should have parked themselves up on taxiway Victor, right where most of the aircraft were departing from. because they could have just topped everybody up and saved them all the trip back, because a lot of aircraft burnt through their fuel margin and their taxi fuel and actually had to taxi back to reschedule the flight and refuel, basically, because they used it all up. So once upon a time, you used to work out fuel in minutes for taxiing. Taxi fuel is a litre allocation. We don't do it in minutes because it's not at the standard cruise fuel flow rate. So your SOPs, your company manual, your ops manual, whatever, will have a range of figures. Could be 5 litres, could be 7 litres, could be 10. Right, but remember, that's the standard taxi fuel. But for example, up here in pitch black, we could have anywhere of up to 30 minutes of fuel, but you've got to allocate it at a standard rate. So you would work out what fuel burn you're actually doing when taxiing and then have a litre allocation. All right, so we don't do it in minutes, it's in litres. All right, so then we've got our trip fuel. Now, trip fuel is the amount of fuel required to enable an aircraft to fly from any point along a route until landing at the destination aerodrome. And it includes, as applicable, the following: fuel for takeoff and climb from departure aerodrome elevation to initial cruising level or altitude, taking into account the expected departure route. Fuel for cruise from top of climb to top of descent, including any step, climb, or descents. Fuel from top of descent to the point where the approach is initiated, taking into account expected arrival procedures, and fuel for executing an approach and landing at a destination aerodrome. This is getting pretty complicated. There's actually quite a bit to drill down and think about here. So, for example, part A there, fuel for takeoff and climb. Now, some people will just go, it's a 100-mile leg and we're going to use this much fuel, irrespective of the height they're climbing to. Some people will break it down into a climb segment, a cruise segment, and a descent segment. And you'll find that a lot of POHs, they have a climb table. Depending on the height you're going to, there'll be a distance and a fuel burn. Then you work out your cruise, then your descent, and it's actually pretty darn accurate. You'll find it very, very accurate. But not everyone does that. All right, but what about the expected routing? Now, this is interesting because this factors into some other things here, that you're not just going to take off from A to B to C and back to A again, are you? You're going to take off, go upwind, turn crosswind, depart overhead. If you're in Darwin here, you might be heading off on a vector for a little while before you actually go. This all adds track miles to your overall fuel plan. Now, it might only be a few litres here and a few litres there, but this stuff all adds up. And what I want you all to understand here is whether you're flying an aeroplane like a 152 or even a RAL style aeroplane that's burning 13 to 23 litres an hour or something much larger. Remember, this conditioning on how we do our fuel planning is setting ourselves up for the future. A lot of the things we do go, why do I need to use a checklist? It's so easy. It's about setting the disciplines now to fly that aircraft and use the checklist so you don't miss things, so that when you get into slightly bigger aircraft and slightly more complicated aircraft, you're in the groove. You're used to using checklists. You're used to following procedures. You're used to doing accurate fuel planning. So the sooner you get into these practices, the easier it will become. If you're going to be doing part B there, like we said, fuel for cruise from top of climb to descent, including any step climbs. So you might have to do a star or a SID because it's the same for top of descent, and some level segments. Are you powering up or are you keeping the power back at that point? What's happening to your fuel flow? Again, it might only be for a few minutes here and a few minutes there, but all of this can add up. So it depends on how accurate you really want to be. Sometimes you just add an extra minute per 1,000 feet onto your cruise fuel. And that works out the same for, or pretty equivalent to your increased climbing fuel burn. But have a look at it and see how accurate your fuel planning actually is next time you go flying, and what you had in the tank when you left, what your fuel log says, which we'll get to in a minute, and dip the tanks and see whether it actually matches or not. All right, and then finally, fuel for executing an approach and landing at the planned destination aerodrome. So you need to factor in that approach fuel as well. We don't just go back to A, like I said, and vertically descend. Think about coming into a bigger airport like Darwin again. You're going to be doing a longer 5 to 10 mile final, a big, long, wide downwind and base, maybe a couple of orbits. So that's all got to be taken into account. Now, part of that process as well of getting from A to B or whatever is en route waypoint, stopping, air work, that sort of thing. So if you're going to be coming in and doing some pipeline inspection or aerial survey, a tour of the Bungle Bungles, Litchfield National Park, Kakadu, any other Rottnest Island sightseeing sort of thing, then that's a delay. That's a holding stage, an airwork stage. And this needs to be also included in this trip fuel. It's very, very important that all of this is allowed for. Think about the fuel flow. You're not going to be smashing around at full power or cruise power. You're going to be throttled back a little bit, slowing down, maybe a stage of flap. So allowing that 15 or 20 minutes of aerial work needs to be included and allocated in your fuel. It could be that along the way you're doing circuits or stopping to do some turns, stalls, whatever else on a nav, on a training flight. So make sure that all of this is allowed for. We can't just go flying and assume that we're going to have fuel for all these little extra things because, like I said, it will all add up at the end. All right, so then the next one is destination alternate fuel. So if we do need one, the amount of fuel that's required to enable an aircraft to do the following: perform a missed approach at the destination aerodrome. So we've just talked about doing approach into the aerodrome, but now our alternate fuel needs to allow for a missed approach or a go-around, a climb to the expected cruise altitude, fly to the expected routing to the destination alternate, descent, an approach, and landing. Now, I can tell you that probably 95% of you out there go, I need an alternate. It's going to be over there. Work out the distance. That times your fuel flow and your TAS, etc., equals how many litres. But no account for the go-around, the climb, how you're actually going to get into that airport, and land. So make sure, again, you're thinking about this. Final result, holding fuel next. So holding fuel, we're pretty common, we're familiar with this one. This happens fairly commonly. And that's our inters and tempos and maybe traffic fuel, traffic holding fuel. Sometimes if the controllers are busy, there's also an allowance for that as well, just in case you might get a bit of holding because of traffic. So inter is 30 minutes, tempo is 60, as we know, and that needs to be allocated. And you need to know what fuel burn that holding is going to be taking place at. You're not necessarily going to be doing that at your full cruise fuel. You're going to be powering back, slowing down, trying to minimize your fuel burn at that point, not just smashing through it, because this is going to affect our time on station if we're really held up. All right, so holding fuel, very, very important. Then our final reserve. So day VFR is 30 minutes now. It used to be 45, but the minimum is 30 minutes. And for night VFR and IFR, it is 45 minutes. Now, some of you will go, well, it's a bit strange because my flight school says 45 or my company says 45. Well, remember, these are advisories. A lot of organizations stuck with the original 45 minutes for everything. So that's what the legal requirements are. If your company wants to do over and above that, not a problem at all. Good idea. All right. But it all depends on where you are and what you're doing. All right. Then we've got our contingency fuel. So our contingency fuel used to be our good old variable reserve. And if you remember, we have aircraft for IFR, VFR charter, then our variable, now contingency fuel, is 5% of the trip fuel. All right, so 5% of the trip fuel is what we need to do there. Then we get into additional fuel. And this one gets a little bit curly, and there are examples in the supplement and how to, advisory circular rather, in how to go about this. But the additional fuel is the supplementary amount of fuel required to allow an aircraft that suffers an engine failure or loss of pressurization at the most critical point along the route, to whichever results in the greater consumption, to proceed to an alternate aerodrome and fly for 15 minutes at holding speed for the aircraft at 1,500 feet above the aerodrome elevation in ISA conditions and make an approach and landing. So there's a bit of calculating to go on there. So that's also be ultimately going towards multi-engine aircraft and turboprop aircraft. So most of you aren't going to have to worry about that one, but a lot of you will. So there is a example in the advisory circular there, which I recommend you check out and have a bit of a read through, and that will help you with that one. All right. Then right at the bottom, we've got discretionary fuel. And this one is an interesting one. It's an amount of fuel to be carried at the discretion of the pilot in command. So as I like to call it, this is your warm and fuzzy fuel. Now, an example could be you are coming into an airport and you just know everyone else is coming and arriving at the same time. So you might decide to carry an extra 15 minutes just to allow, there's no traffic holding in the AIP, no TAMs or anything else. It's just in the ERSA, it's just saying that I know it's going to be busy. I want to carry an extra 15 minutes or 10 minutes. So that's the warm and fuzzy fuel. That's the one you're going to be challenged on the most if payload's a real issue. Sometimes you might not to get the warm and fuzzy fuel on board because there's just no room. All right, but that's what that's for. And then ultimately at the end is your margin fuel. That's everything left over that has not been allocated. Now, there is a bit of a common misperception, I guess, that margin fuel is just there to be burned. And this is, of course, true, but we don't want to just go, yep, here's my trip fuel and I've got all that left over. Because this is what's contributed to various accidents where everyone thought they had plenty of spare, but after some diversions and tracking a bit longer than they meant to, climbing longer than they thought they would, doing air work or anything else in areas that they didn't allocate and plan for, and next minute, that fuel is all but gone. Okay, so this is what's really, really crucial and important. And what we want to have a think about then is the actual, once we've got the fuel plan done and we get underway, the in-flight fuel management then becomes the most crucial part, because it's all well and good on the ground to say we've got plenty of fuel, but unless we manage it appropriately in flight, then it's all for nat. So mastering that skill, ensuring the safety and efficiency of our flight is the most important thing. We need to have some effective fuel management processes in place. And as always, this begins right at the beginning with that thorough pre-flight planning. But during the flight, we need to then make sure that it's all happening as expected. So first thing we need to do is adhere to good solid power settings for the altitude we're flying that optimizes our fuel most efficiently. This could be a normal cruise, long range cruise, best economy, leaner peak, richer peak, all these sort of different power settings of mixture, manifold pressure settings and RPMs. And these are all in your aircraft POH and will also be part of your company SOPs that will tell you what power settings are expected, what fuel flow that gives you so that you can flight plan effectively on that. So understanding how those changes in throttle settings, mixture control, if you've got an aeroplane that actually has a fuel computer, next time have a look at what it's reading when you're at full noise, full takeoff power. Have a look at how many liters are going through there. And if you take a long time to bring that back, you could very well be burning a lot more fuel than you realize. High altitudes, anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 feet, leaning obviously becomes essential. We're getting into that thinner air. Upwards of 7,000 to 8,000 feet is usually where normally aspirated engines are most efficient. But we don't want to not lean at any level, really. All right, we level in taxi, don't we? So why not at 1,500 feet? We're always going to be burning more fuel to the air ratio that we actually have. So getting that chemically correct mixture, whether you run rich or lean a peak EGT is up to you. And lean a peak is fine. Many operators up here do it, but it needs to be done properly or you'll do damage to your engine. One of the key aspects, monitoring fuel levels against the planned usage. So we should be regularly comparing the actual fuel remaining with the expected fuel burn at various waypoints. This is going to allow for the detection of discrepancies. So we want to make sure that at each waypoint, we've got an idea of how much fuel we should have. OzRunways and AvPlan does all this for you. And when you get there, it will give you an expected fuel amount on board based on the fuel plan flows. You need to compare this against your gauges, your fuel calibration card, your fuel computer, depending on what you've got on board, because that will be measuring what's actually going through the engine. If you don't have anything like that, if you're just flying a good old 172 or something with standard gauges, then you're just going to have to do your best with the fuel calibration to make sure it's roughly all making sense and the needles are pointing where you'd expect them to. Early detection of that is going to give you an idea of higher than anticipated fuel consumption. Some aircraft, like we've got in the Mallard and G1000s and all that, will be showing you your expected fuel on arrival based on the current flows. And this is all fantastic data that you can then play with and manipulate with your power settings and leaning as appropriate to get the fuel flows right, to ensure that you land with plenty of fuel on board and know what you've got on board if you need to do something like a diversion. Headwinds are obviously a real killer. The winds are worse than what you did. Take note of the winds as you climb. If you've got a better ground speed at one level than the other, you don't even need a wind indicator. Just look at the ground speed as you pass through a level. If it drops right off, then get a clearance down lower or descend, depending on what airspace you're in. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking is, yeah, but my fuel gauges are crap. And this may well be the case, but they are a legal requirement. Some are more accurate than others. We know some are better at the top end, some in the middle, some at the bottom, but they are ultimately all we have. So do all that in conjunction with your fuel log. Now, what is a good fuel log? Again, I see all sorts of things. Scratches on scrap paper, back of the fuel docket and everything else. We should have a proper piece of paper or the iPad set up for an accurate fuel log. Should be recording what we loaded and what we departed with once that's all been established. And then every half an hour or when you do your clear offs and that sort of thing, we should be checking your fuel flow, checking that we've managed our tanks appropriately and comparing the fuel burn with our planned consumption and make sure we detect those discrepancies early. That's going against logging our flight time as well. As we cross over waypoints, we should be logging the time we're there. And then keeping an eye on our engine settings. So what's our EGTs and everything else, anything that RPM setting, mixture settings that might affect our fuel consumption and our fuel plan as we decided before we left what we were going to be burning. Is it actually what we're doing? Because otherwise it doesn't really matter, doesn't it? It's all for nat. If we notice the consumption is higher, then we need to reassess things. So we might just need to adjust the power setting, might be able to descend or climb into better winds, or we might have to just ultimately land somewhere nearby on the way and grab some more fuel. You'll be surprised how many people have arrogantly pushed on, not wanting the embarrassment or humiliation or thinking she'll be right, and run out of fuel within miles of the airport. I can tell you what I would say is more embarrassing. All right, so definitely want to be not doing that. Make the decision early. Once you land, as I said earlier, check the data. So work out what your fuel log and plan says that you should have on board. Get up, dip the tanks, see what it says. Hopefully it's within a few litres. If there's a big difference, then have a think about why. Did you just do some bad math? Were you a bit inaccurate with your guessing and things, or did you misread something? Or maybe the aeroplane is just burning more fuel than it should, and there might be a maintenance issue as well. So keep an eye on that and report all that as needed. So when you are going flying, ultimately, you need to be prepared for the unexpected. And Darwin has had, I guess in a way, a lot of that, and we've got a lot of it coming up with the wet season. Anywhere across the top half of Australia, we're going to be getting busy, and we're going to have to hold. We're going to have 60 to 30 minutes of holding fuel. But then, as I've said in other episodes, once that weather passes or the traffic delay, like all the jets returning from pitch black, then we've got 15 to 20 aircraft all then trying to get into the airport. So the waiting and holding is not over. It comes a time where we have to give an idea to air traffic control how much fuel we've got. How long can we stay here and hold? And what's my last time of diversion? If you're not keeping an eye on your fuel and just assuming it's all going to be okay, you're going to struggle to make that decision. All right. So first of all, you've got wherever you're holding to your destination. How far is that? And how much fuel do you need to do it? Then the difference between that and your final reserve is really your holding fuel. That's the fuel you've got. Working out your holding fuel rate, divide that into that, and then that will tell you how many minutes you've got left on station to hold. If you need to divert somewhere else, well, then that might be closer or further away from your holding position to the destination. So you'll have to adjust that. And that could be we need to either come in or divert in 5 minutes. So that would be our last time to divert fuel. And make sure that we communicate that with the controller, because the last thing we want to do is get into a Mayday fuel situation, which is where we are down to our final reserve. So Mayday fuel doesn't mean I've got no fuel left. It means I'm now into my final reserve. Because ultimately, our holding fuel, our contingency fuel, our discretionary fuel, our additional fuel, our approach fuel, all of that can be burnt. But final fuel should be always left intact when we land. So when we go into that, that's when it's game on and we need to let people know. So should never hesitate to divert for fuel if we need to. And we need to keep an eye on our fuel levels and flows and all that so that if we do need to go somewhere else, we can. The other thing we need to be really, really careful of is our fuel tank management. Now, some of you are just used to flying around on both. When you move into something like the 210 or 206, depending on the model, there is no both. You have a left and a right. A lot of Pipers are like that as well. So what happens? You're used to flying around on both all the time. You'll go flying. You'll forget to change tanks. Next minute, you've got a huge fuel imbalance. Now, when you get into bigger, larger aircraft, there is a limit on the fuel imbalance that you can have. Not to mention, it's just poor fuel tank management. All right, but worse than that, we could have auxiliary tanks, tip tanks, and the way we switch between those tanks needs to be done effectively and correctly. Otherwise, we can have a situation where we did with the latest accident report and the Navajo or Chieftain crash landing due to fuel starvation. It had plenty of fuel on board, but not in the tank that was currently selected. All right, there are multiple other issues in there due to fatigue and other things, but this is all part and parcel of understanding your aircraft and operating it effectively and knowing how much fuel is in each tank so that if one tank becomes inaccessible, such as the 310, for example, if we had an engine failure, that's an engine-driven fuel pump for the auxiliary tank, that fuel is now no longer available. We need to take that out of our fuel allocation and then reassess whether we still got the fuel to get to where we're going or we need to make an alternate plan. All right. So lots and lots to think about there, guys. But bit of a longer episode, but finding that there are still a lot of fuel accidents. This is the takeaway from the seminar, that despite a lot of these changes and educational campaigns, the rate of starvation accidents and incidents has not changed, which is kind of crazy if you ask me. I was actually surprised by that statistic. So we really want to make sure that we're thinking about all of that and keeping an eye on things. I know when I take everyone out in the 210 or 206, forget to change fuel tanks. I've flown in other more complicated twins like the twin Comanches, where they've got the main tanks, auxiliary tanks, tip tanks, and ineffective tank switching would have most likely led to a bit of a scare. If at that point they don't realize and then quickly change to the tank rather than go into a full forced landing mode, well, then, yeah, they're going to have a forced landing. So all of this stuff is absolutely crucial in managing the fuel and being aware of what you're doing. All right, that's it for this week's episode. Hope you got something out of that and have a bit of a think about how you go about things. Thanks for all the feedback, everybody. Thank you for all those that have joined on Patreon. It's so awesome to have you there and that support. That's really helping things out. And remember, every week now there is an article in addition to the podcast. Come on, guys. Like, how much more do you need? So much information. Share it with your friends. Tell everybody all about it. Let's get everybody on there. Get everyone informed. Start leaving comments. Interact. It comes into your email, but you can also talk online. Share the articles with your friends, and let's just get everyone educated, help raise the standards all together, and go from there. Next week, I will be in Brisbane and participating at the request of CASA and others to be part of an instructor workshop, which they're doing. I'll talk more about that afterwards. And then, of course, that Thursday night is the Australian Aviation Awards. So it should be a fantastic week. I'll be off that week, but I will leave you a podcast before I go, don't worry, and look forward to hopefully sharing the success of picking up a few awards that night, and but ultimately the success of everyone that's there and everyone's achievements, irrespective. So it should be a great night, and I will talk to you when I get back from that. All right, until then, flick me a message, send me an email. If you want to do some flying, like I said, there's a couple little holes. The rest is all full-time training in February. If you want to do flight training, email me, info@trentrobinsonaviation.com.au. If you just want to leave a message or chat about anything else, feel free to do that on the socials. But I'm just finding if you can email me for actual flight training requests is easiest for me to try and track and find everything. All right. Until then, blue skies, stay safe, keep the fuel in your tanks, and ultimately, remember the golden rule: aviate, navigate, communicate. Thanks for listening. See you soon.